and we're going to do a live transcript. We're going to go ahead and enable auto transcription, so we're good there. Okay, so I have a couple of quick announcements for you. I believe we have a 10th quiz that I have not opened up yet, but I will open it up after class, and it will be due on Friday at 11:55 p.m. So please get that in. It'll cover psychological disorders. So if you take it now, it will be a really good study aid. Additionally, after class, I am going to start recording the review session for your 4th exam. So you'll have that by this afternoon and you can start watching it. I do realize we have a few people who are sick. So if you were watching this, or if by any chance you get sick tomorrow or on Wednesday, please shoot me an email as soon as possible so that I can make arrangements for you to get that exam knocked out. Okay? Does that sound pretty good? So contact me if you're not feeling well and you don't think you'll be here on Wednesday. Like, if you have COVID or the flu on Wednesday, definitely don't come in. Don't put your fellow classmates at risk if you don't have to. But do feel free to send me an email. I would appreciate that. I will work with you. We will make sure that that 4th exam is good to go. Does anybody have any questions? I do want to check one thing. I want to see how many people have completed course evaluations so that we can get some extra credit. If you want some extra credit, and I think you do. Let's go ahead and check. It was pretty darn close, I think. Okay, we are at 48%. That's a little less than half. So if you want to get some extra credit points, we need at least 75% of the class to complete their evaluations by Friday. And I was going to say cognitive is almost there. So if you know somebody in cognitive that hasn't taken their evaluations yet, they're at 72%. So they're pretty darn close to getting it. Not that it's a competition. You're doing way better than the research methods class where I've had a whopping 1 person. Yeah. And I've even given the extra credit incentive. So yeah. Okay. So anyway, it's a tough class and they are all very tired. All right. The remote's up at the top and I can't grab it. Okay, there we go.
I know you mentioned before, but when is the final?
The final? Well, first of all, when in doubt, always check the syllabus. It's been in your syllabus since August. However, I am not heartless. It is on Wednesday. So it's next Wednesday from 10 to 12 right here. So if you're taking that optional final, just a reminder, it is short. There's no short answer. It's 50 multiple choice questions. Most of you, if you take it, will be done within an hour. You get a cheat sheet. So you get to bring in a cheat sheet with you. And this year I am allowing for typed. It can be front and back, about the size of a piece of paper. So 8.5 by 11 inches. And I already posted the study guide for the final. On the 11th, I am going to record a review session for you so you can watch that and have a couple of days to prepare. Does that sound pretty good? All right. Let's finish up social psychology so that we can talk about some psychological disorders and be prepared for the final exam. So the last 2 things that I want to talk about, so we talked about de-individuation, but we also need to talk about what is referred to as group polarization. So one of the things that is kind of interesting is that when you are around people who believe what you believe, what often will end up happening is that your attitudes will become even stronger when you are discussing your ideas with other people. So where this kind of comes into play, there's been a lot of talk for about the past 6 years, give or take, maybe a little longer, that with things like social media, we are encouraged to be in these ideological bubbles. Most of our friends believe what we believe. Most of our romantic partners believe what we believe. And generally, for the most part, and I would say this is true for a lot of people, it's really hard to be around people that have different points of view from us. The problem with that is, and don't get me wrong, I do understand wanting to be around people who share your ideas and don't think they're ridiculous. I think that's important. It's validating. However, it does have the side effect of basically making your opinions even stronger. Are you two okay back there? Okay, I need to make sure you're focusing. So our attitudes are often going to be strengthened by discussing with other people. So here we have two different groups. You can kind of see what happens is we have a continuum in terms of strength of an opinion. And folks, this could be any kind of opinion. So this could be, for example, whether or not you think it's okay to eat French fries on the beach. So here are the people who are against it because they don't want to bring seagulls to the beach. And here are the people who are for it. They really love French fries and they want to have them everywhere. And then you have some people who are in the middle. So before the group discussion, you can see we have a very nice continuum of attitudes, and we have some people who are in the center. What happens if we discuss, so if I basically divide the people who are against it and the people who are for it, and let them discuss with each other why they agree or disagree with French fries on beaches, what you're going to find is that after that group discussion, look, nobody's in the middle anymore. Everybody has become more extreme in their beliefs. And obviously, this is not my area. This is something you would probably hear more about in a political science class. But a lot of political attitudes are also kind of shaping up to be that way. People are moving more toward the extremes, and we have a lot less in the center. So here's kind of another example that you can kind of see of this. So researchers have had people who were very highly prejudiced against certain groups, and people who were very low in prejudice against certain groups. Now, before the discussion, obviously, there's going to be some differences between these two groups, but those differences become even more extreme when you are basically having discussions with people that think like you. Now, it's part of the reason, again, that I would say that your information diet is really important. Now, am I saying that you should listen to stuff that is outright hateful? No, you shouldn't listen to that kind of stuff in general if you can possibly avoid it. But it's really important to acknowledge that we all have different sorts of perspectives, and that those perspectives we don't always get an opportunity to see those perspectives when we're constantly surrounded by people who think like us and believe what we believe. One of the best parts about college for me was being exposed to people that had different ideas and different ways of seeing the world from me. College is a really great opportunity for that, for sure. It's all about opening your mind and broadening your worldview. All right, does anybody have any questions? Well, that's good because we're done with social psych. All right, we did it. I have already put these notes in full online, so you are good to go. So we're going to talk about, and I know some of you have been waiting all semester for this. I know. People really like talking about psychological disorders. It's really interesting. So we're going to finish up by talking about psychological disorders. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, wait. I can fix this. Watch, I can fix this. Watch this. Okay. Well, not quite. Okay, so here's what we want. We want variance. Okay. I can't change everything, but what I can do is I can change the color really quick so it's less bad. Let's see. I know. Where are colors? Here we go. Okay, there. Look at how peaceful that is. Look at how peaceful that is. Now you don't have that horrible purple glare. I feel like a hero right now. Wait. You need to give me a minute.
You're the hero of my eyes.
Okay. So I know that this is the part that that quite a few of you have been waiting for. And I think it's one of the more interesting things to talk about when we talk about psychology. So I want to ask you a big question. So how do we think about mental illness or poor mental health? So let's be completely honest. You and I all have moments in our life where we have been anxious. I have a faculty meeting tomorrow and I am very anxious about it. We have all had moments where we're sad. We have all had moments where we have grieved a loss. My question to you is, where do we draw the line between what is ordinary or quote unquote normal behavior and what is not? Can anybody give me an example of a distinction between what we would consider normal behavior and abnormal behavior? Yeah, Nadine.
What I've always heard is if it starts like affecting your day-to-day life, that's a little for like a long period of time, more than just like a day or two.
Okay.
That's where
So I'm seeing a couple of different things here. So first of all, it has to be pretty chronic, you're suggesting. And the other thing that you mentioned is that it has to basically affect your daily functioning in some sort of way.
I don't know if that's true. That's just what I've always been.
Okay. And I think that's totally reasonable. Anybody else? So what would be a normal amount of anxiety? What would we consider normal? Yeah, Luca.
Being anxious about a big job opportunity.
Okay. So being nervous before a job interview or a big exam or something like that. What would we consider abnormal anxiety?
Being nervous to be on a phone call with somebody that you know very well.
Okay, so in this particular case, phone calls, even for people that you know well, could be a problem. So the intensity or the relationship. That was a really pleasant sound. I liked that. Those were some very pleasant beeps. So in this instance, we're basically saying that it's debilitating to the point where even people that you know and have a good relationship with would have a problem with this. Okay, so we're going to talk some more about what the line is between normal and abnormal behavior, because guess what? It's a short answer question. But this is basically the realm of clinical psychology. So clinical psychology is all about understanding, classifying, and treating disorders. Now, clinical psychologists do research. Counselors and therapists do not necessarily do research. So a clinical psychologist is somebody that is going to do research on different types of disorders. So for example, when I was in graduate school, our clinical psychology program at MU, which I was not a part of, I was in cognition and neuroscience, we had a very strong alcohol research program. So we actually looked at, the researchers actually looked at people that had issues with alcohol. Now you might be kind of curious why issues related to drug abuse are treated as psychological disorders. Well, they are, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. Okay, so what is required for something to be considered a psychological disorder? So this needs to be an ongoing pattern of thoughts or feelings. So that kind of hits at what Nadine mentioned. This has to be something that has been going on for a little while. So we're not talking, how many of you felt pretty bummed out with the time change? It's, folks, sunset is at 4:58. How many of you are kind of bummed that it's getting colder and you don't want to go outside and stuff like that? The winter blues is normal for a lot of people. However, if the winter blues are so bad, that you are having trouble getting to class on a pretty, like even coming to class for a prolonged period of time, like a week or two, that's going to be an issue. So we're looking at what are called the 3 Ds. So first of all, we're looking at thoughts or feelings that are deviant. They are different from normal. So for example, hearing voices, at least in our culture at this time, is considered to be deviant in nature. So it deviates, it is different from the norm. Somebody with autism spectrum disorder is not going to make eye contact pretty regularly with people the way that somebody who is neurotypical would. So there's some deviation, there's a difference there. Now, what is deviant is very much defined by the time that you live in and the culture that you live in. There are some places where hearing voices is not seen as a problem, but is rather seen as a type of spiritual enlightenment. That would not be considered deviant for that culture. In addition to these thoughts or feelings or behaviors that are deviant, they have to be distressful. If not distressful to you, then to somebody else. If you are drinking to the point where you are regularly driving home drunk, that is incredibly distressful. That may not necessarily be distressful for you, but it is distressful to somebody. And then finally, we have dysfunctional. So Nadine, you hit on this again. If it interferes with your everyday life, it is dysfunctional. If it's hurting your ability to live your life the way that you normally would, it becomes a problem. If you're struggling with depression so much that you are having trouble getting out of bed to get to your job on time, or you are no longer taking part in the things that you normally took part in, that is becoming dysfunctional. If it's hurting your ability to do what you need to do every day, at that point, it becomes a problem. So for that short answer question on Wednesday, think about those 3 Ds. They have to be deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that our understanding of mental illness and psychological disorders has evolved over time. Now, originally, this was often believed to be the cause of things like demons or of supernatural forces. So if you were struggling with mental health, it was usually because you had a demon and you needed to be exorcised from that, or there were supernatural forces, or you were a bad person and you needed to be cleansed because you had a sickness in your soul. And here's the thing, first of all, that's really victim blaming. Second of all, because we believed that people brought these things upon themselves, people were treated very, very poorly when they struggled with mental illness. And folks, I am not saying that the way that we talk about mental illness is perfect, but we are a very, very long way from being like it is caused by demons. Now, I know that there are some people who will still say that they are caused by demons. I am saying, no, they're not. It's a combination of that biopsychosocial model that we talked about at the very beginning of this class. Psychological phenomena are caused by biological things, psychological things, and environmental things. And they all interconnect with each other. Now, one of the first people to really talk about treating people with psychological disorders in a better way was Philippe Pinel. Philippe Pinel believed that mental illness was not due to demons or supernatural forces or being a bad person, but rather, and a lot of people agree with this today, issues related to stress and also inhumane conditions. And of course, the way that we treated people for poor mental health generally did not have the ability to make people feel better. If you were locked away in an asylum or a sanitarium and you had no physical contact with anybody and you were isolated, well, that's generally not going to make for a mentally healthy person, now is it? Not at all. So Pinnell believed that what should be done is called a moral treatment. So basically, you take care of people. You make sure that they take walks outside. You let them engage in creative activities. You let them interact with other people. When you treat them well, oftentimes some of these conditions will improve. So Pinnell really believed in treating these people like people, not aberrations. All right. So something that also kind of changed how we view mental illness was basically the discovery that some mental disorders can actually be due to underlying physical or biological causes. So this is where the medical model comes in. And I would add that the medical model almost completely favors biological explanations for disorders. And something that is coming to light, especially quite recently, is that only focusing on biology when we talk about psychological disorders is sometimes doing people a disservice, because there are some things that biological science does not seem to be able to explain when we talk about mental disorders. But I'll get to that in a minute. So it was found, so how many of you are familiar with syphilis? Not personally familiar, but you know what syphilis is. As you know, it is a sexually transmitted infection. It is curable through antibiotics, but remember that antibiotics were only created in the 20th century. And so if syphilis was basically contracted, if you need to go get some paper towels to clean that up, that's okay. So when you leave syphilis untreated, it is going to really start messing with your brain. You will start to see neurological symptoms like hallucinations. And so researchers found out that a lot of things that look like mental illness were actually just untreated syphilis. Folks, should you contract syphilis, go get some antibiotics, for heaven's sake. It will mess with your brain if it's left untreated. So we have this idea that these causes, these biological causes, can be diagnosed, treated, and cured. So especially in the 20th century, we start to see mental illness being treated, usually in hospitals or in clinics and through doctors, rather than other means. So something that I was kind of alluding to when I was growing up in the 1980s and the 1990s, something that you would often hear about depression in particular, the phrase that was used was a chemical imbalance. So for whatever reason, and it was believed that it was serotonin in particular that was the issue. So your body did not produce enough serotonin, and serotonin is connected with mood, and thus people tended to be depressed. So a lot of prescriptions at the time that are used to treat depression usually involve serotonin in some way. So most of them will prevent serotonin from being taken back up into neurons so that more serotonin can circulate through the system, and thus that should alleviate the problems. Now, this is what was believed, but here's a couple of things that we know. And if you're taking my biopsych class next semester, we're actually going to be talking about it a little bit more at the end of the semester. So first of all, the benefits of serotonin, basically SSRIs, which are typically the front line for depression, their benefits are only modest. Now, for every person that actually finds help from this, and let's be clear, some people are absolutely helped by SSRIs, you can find a few others that it did not help or it did not have an effect on. I was going to say that back over the summer, a lot of academic Twitter, especially in psychology, kind of got rocked by this paper that kind of suggested that despite the fact that we use these kind of treatments for depression, this idea that it's due to low serotonin or even just a chemical imbalance of neurotransmitters isn't well supported. And in fact, some people believe that depression largely happens not because of a chemical or a biological issue, but an environmental issue, that it's basically a response to stress. We have a lot to learn, but it's very clear that when we talk about these disorders, we can't just focus on the biology. We have to focus on the psychological aspects and the cultural and social aspects as well. It is a complex issue, and I wish we had more understanding, but at this point, we still have a lot to learn. Now, as I've mentioned, it's important to remember this biopsychosocial approach. There is more than just a biological cause. Your environment and your culture also defines what is considered a disorder and what is not. In Latin American countries, for example, there is what is referred to as susto. So we're talking about what are referred to as culture-bound syndromes. This is a particular fear of black magic. In areas like Japan, we have things like taijin kyofusho, which is a very, very enhanced fear of blushing, like anxiety related to blushing. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we tend to see higher rates of eating disorders, such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder, compared to other countries, particularly those in the Eastern Hemisphere. Additionally, there are certain types of personality characteristics that will make psychological disorders more or less likely. Is there anybody here who thinks they're pretty high in that personality trait, neuroticism? Yeah, I am. I'm not ashamed to admit it. So remember, we talked about the big 5 factors. Neuroticism is basically emotional stability. So if you're high in neuroticism, you feel the highs and the lows of things very strongly. If you are low in neuroticism, you're pretty even-keeled. We know that people that are higher in neuroticism tend to be a little bit more susceptible to things like mood disorders and anxiety disorders. Okay. Anybody have any questions so far? So remember, everything is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. That even includes psychological disorders. There's more than just biology here. Biology is important. Things happen in your brain, but there's more to it than just that. Okay, so how do we classify and diagnose different types of psychological disorders? So classification can actually be really useful. Not everybody likes diagnoses. Some people believe that diagnoses basically create a label, and you can use that label as a form of identity. But I would argue that classification is useful because, first of all, it describes behavior that you are seeing. So if somebody says to me, this person has bipolar disorder, I will already know what kind of behavior I am likely to see. I am going to see cycles of manic, impulsive behavior followed by cycles of depression. Additionally, classification is useful because it gives us a prognosis Is this something that you are going to need to take medication for? Is this something that therapy could be useful for? Now, for example, if we're talking about something like bipolar or something like schizophrenia, medication is going to be really important. If we're talking about something like generalized anxiety disorder or standard depression, you may not necessarily need medication. So some of these are going to give you a prognosis, and they are going to have different types of suggestions for treatment. Now, here in the United States, we have what is called the DSM-5. Now, there has been an update to the DSM-5 as of early 2022. So now it is technically called the DSM-5-TR. So the TR means that it's been revised, but the DSM-5 is what we tend to use to classify these different psychological disorders. Now, when I first started teaching here at Cotty, the DSM-5 had just come out and some big changes happened compared to the DSM 4th edition. So the 4th edition came out in the 90s, I think around 1994. The DSM-5 was a very huge change. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those changes. Okay, does anybody need some more time here? Okay, so one of the things, this is me personally, I first learned about the DSM-4 when I was in graduate school. So I'm going to level with you. I never took an abnormal psychology class in undergrad. I was only interested in cognitive and the brain, and that is all I took. So I didn't get exposed to abnormal psychology until I was a teaching assistant for a class. And I had to sit in on every single class. And so I actually learned a lot about the DSM-4. Now, something really cool that the DSM-4 did was that they had a multi-axis system. So major types, so you had these different axes. So you had Axis 1 were like your major disorders. Axis 2 were like your personality disorders. Axis 3 were like different types of diseases or disorders or chronic conditions that you had that weren't psychological. Axis 4 was kind of what was going on in your environment and your social life. And then Axis 5 was basically an overall score of health in a numerical form. So I kind of liked the axis system because it kind of gave you a global outlook of what was going on in this person's life, and it would help you understand other things going on that you might recommend certain types of treatment for. Well, in the DSM-5, they got rid of that. I kind of miss it, but there were a couple of other disorders that were changed as well. So back in the DSM-4, we had autism, we had Asperger's syndrome, and we had persistent developmental delay not otherwise specified. And those all got lumped into autism spectrum disorder as of the DSM-5. So we technically don't really refer to it as Asperger's, especially if you have high intellectual ability. We don't call it Asperger's. Also, look up Asperger, he's kind of iffy, as in Nazi. So we call it autism spectrum disorder now. OCD and PTSD used to be thought of as anxiety disorders. And when I first got here to Cotty, the previous edition of the textbook that I started with, I think it was like maybe the 3rd edition. We're like on the 6th right now. Those were considered anxiety disorders. As of the DSM-5, OCD is considered an impulse control disorder. PTSD is considered a trauma disorder. Major depression had some changes to what qualified as depression. So as of the DSM-4, if you were grieving the loss of somebody at that time, you could not be diagnosed with depression. So basically it was called the bereavement exclusion. As of the DSM-5, they got rid of the bereavement exclusion. So you can be grieving and be depressed at the same time. And then finally, we added a few new disorders. So we added binge eating disorder as an eating disorder, along with anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And we had premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Now, let's be very clear. Getting upset right around the time of a period is not PMDD. We are talking about a significantly more debilitating emotional change due to fluctuation in hormones. So both of these were added to the DSM-5. All right, everybody good? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of having something like the DSM. So first of all, what we do tend to find is that the categories and the criteria are very reliable. So if I know that somebody is struggling with depression, I have a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like. And if I talk to other clinicians, they're going to have a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like too. But here's what's kind of interesting. Based on the criteria of the current DSM-5, it is estimated, or at least back in 2014 when it came out, it was estimated that 50% of the US population would struggle with a psychological disorder at some point in their lives. Now, why is that? So it could be that we're getting better at detecting psychological disorders. Our grandparents probably didn't have the language to talk about psychological disorders or the acceptance that we do. And it's possible that because of the way that our society is set up, more of us are struggling. We could technically be getting sicker. Other people have argued it's because now we have more categories and we have easier criteria. So that's kind of your cynic's point of view, for those of you that are a bit more cynical in nature. Okay. Okay. Everybody good? Anybody needs some more time? Okay. Now, let's finish up by talking about anxiety disorders so you are good to go. We're going to do it, y'all. We're going to do it. We're going to make it in time for the exam. And I won't have to record extra stuff besides the review session. Yeah. Okay. So, here's the overview of our anxiety disorders. So, anxiety disorders are going to be marked by distressing or persistent anxiety. So remember, being nervous before a speech that you have to give is normal. Interestingly enough, some people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. Like, if it were me, I think my priorities would be a little different. So we have distressing, persistent anxiety that is above and beyond what we would consider normal. Remember those 3 Ds. So like, it's normal to get nervous before a big test. It is probably not as normal to have a panic attack every time you go into the classroom because of the possibility of there being a test. That's probably going to be a little bit different. In addition, we are going to talk about behaviors that are potentially distressing or dysfunctional that are designed to reduce that anxiety. So we're going to talk about 3 different anxiety disorders, and we're going to talk about 2 former anxiety disorders, OCD and PTSD. Everybody good? All right. So we're going to start with generalized anxiety disorder. And folks, this is something I can personally tell you I have struggled with. Thankfully, one of the nice things about generalized anxiety disorder is that remission is possible. However, because a lot of this is based on a way of thinking, a very persistent way of thinking, you're always going to have to be mindful of your thoughts, because having recurring episodes is also pretty common for people with GAD. So we have continuous persistent worrying. These people may be jittery, on edge, sleep deprived. They just can't shut their anxious thoughts off. Now, what we're going to find in particular is that this anxiety is often going to be free floating in nature. So what this means is it's going to shift from topic to topic to topic. So for example, this is something that occasionally happened to me. I have a little bit of health anxiety. In my defense, I have a family history of brain problems. And so if something feels a little bit off, like if my head feels a little fuzzy, or if I feel a tingling in my fingers, my first instinct is to go, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke. And then, of course, it turns out that I'm not having a stroke, but I've managed to work myself up into such a state that now I am having a panic attack and I believe I am dying. And then my anxiety shifts to, oh my gosh, I'm going to die here at work. So you kind of see that the topic of the anxiety shifts from thing to thing to thing, and it never really shuts itself off. Now, I will mention that generalized anxiety disorder is, at least for right now, for a while, depression was the more common psychological disorder. It has shifted to anxiety. We have more people that are anxious than that are depressed. And for some people, yes, you can have both of these, because the anxiety will often fuel the depression. This is more common in people that identify as female. It does decline with age. Yes. No, it can get worse. Like, I had panic attacks with mine, and you usually don't hear about panic attacks with it. That's pretty severe. I don't quite understand what you mean, I think, because you're shaking your head.
It's an anxiety disorder. I feel like we should be connected that with anxiety attacks. But I don't know. I tried to do my own research on anxiety disorders, and I feel like there isn't a lot.
There really isn't. There really isn't. I can tell you that the medication for anxiety disorders is usually going to be antidepressants. We know some things. So some of what we do know with anxiety is that oftentimes there's too much activity going on in the amygdala, and the sympathetic nervous system is often going to be heightened because your thoughts and your anxious worries create stress. So you're constantly running at a very, very high level of stress. Now, one thing that I've heard that can be really useful if your sympathetic nervous system is kind of heightened, as it can be with anxiety disorders, is deep breathing, particularly breathing from your diaphragm for a long period of time. And that's because your diaphragm is connected to your vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve controls a lot of different things in your body, including slowing down your heart rate. So the idea is that by stimulating the vagus nerve, you slow down the heart rate and you allow that parasympathetic nervous system to kind of kick into gear. But yeah, generally treatments for anxiety disorders include things like antidepressants or a little more hardcore benzodiazepines like Xanax, which can be really, really habit forming. We can talk a little bit more about this after class if you'd like to. Okay, sounds good. Okay. So panic disorder is a little bit different. So I remember when I was struggling with my panic attacks, I asked my therapist, Why didn't they diagnose me with panic disorder? And my therapist was basically like, because the panic wasn't produced by a particular thing. So I wasn't getting them in the same place, in the same situation. Usually what would happen is I'd have too much caffeine. That would kickstart my sympathetic nervous system, and then I'd get a panic attack. I can tell you, if you struggle with anxiety, caffeine is not your friend. I am not telling you to get rid of it entirely, but I am saying try to find opportunities to reduce use where you can. At least in my experience, that worked for me. But panic attacks are often going to be marked by intense dread, terror, chest pain, choking, other physical symptoms. These can be misread as heart attacks or strokes. Oftentimes with panic disorder, these will occur with specific triggers. However, what's often very tricky about panic disorder is that sometimes these triggers are not obvious. That was a hardcore cough, Kuiper. That one, like, that reminds me of a cough that I gave in middle school that was like that. And one of my classmates was like, that was chewy. Like, ew. Oh, well, I'm glad it wasn't worse. I am very glad it wasn't worse. Now, oftentimes what we're going to find with a lot of people that have panic disorder, these are going to happen in public places. And because of that, they may develop a fear of heading out in public called agoraphobia. So it becomes a fear of public places because panic attacks are happening in public places. So the idea is, if you avoid that panic attack, or if you avoid the public, you avoid that trigger. So your mind is trying to look for patterns, and it thinks it's figured out, hey, if I stay out of sight, these things won't happen. So we got to talk a little bit about phobias. Huh?
It's about the spider.
Oh, but it's fuzzy. It's cute. Oh,
Definitely do not. Bad idea.
ew. Why would anybody inhale a tarantula?
Here's the thing, that's their defense mechanism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Their abdomen put hairs at you using their back legs.
So I want to be really clear that there's a difference between a phobia and a simple fear. Now, a simple fear is if I see a snake while I'm out in the park, I freak out a little bit and I jump. A phobia would be, oh, I do too. A phobia would be, I'm not going to that park at all just on the possibility that there might be a snake there. And if you try to take me to the park, I am probably going to have a debilitating freak out because of the possibility that a snake might be there. So the difference between a phobia and a simple fear is how intense the fear is and the lengths that you will go to avoid that thing. So a specific phobia is a phobia that is focused on a particular object or situation. So like arachnophobia, a fear of spiders, astrophobia, fear of thunderstorms and severe weather. We have things like social phobia. That's an intense fear and avoidance of social situations, and agoraphobia, which is a fear of situations that produce panic and panic attacks.
Is there a study on like why people are afraid or why people have
phobias? So there's a wide variety of differences. So we know that phobias tend to run in families, so there could be a genetic component. We also know that phobias can be learned either through observational learning or through experience. So a snake fell on my shoulder when I was a child. I'm not kidding. It fell out of a tree and landed right on my shoulder. That'd make anybody afraid of snakes. So some of it is from watching other people. Some of it is from learning. Some of it is from genetics. So it's kind of a combination of different things. Well, I didn't have as much time as I thought to cover the rest, so I will talk some more about this on our study guide review, which I am about to go record right now. Finish writing this down. I think you will be okay. And again, if you think you're not going to be here on Wednesday because you're sick, shoot me an email. I will work with you. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all here on Wednesday. Bye, everybody. Thank you.